Elena had always loved visiting her grandfather's countryside home, a place where the air smelled of hay and earth, where the trees whispered with every breeze, and where time seemed slower than in the noisy city she usually lived in. She remembered arriving that morning with a mixture of excitement and curiosity, the sun low on the horizon casting golden light over the fields, the leaves crunching softly under her boots, and when she stepped out of the car, her grandfather was already waiting. At the edge of the stone path, leaning slightly on his cane, eyes sparkling with a mysterious energy she had never seen before, and he smiled, that warm, familiar smile that made her feel like a child again, and without a word, he gestured for her to follow. His movements calm but deliberate, and as they walked through the dew-kissed grass, Elena noticed the way the old farmhouse glimmered in the early sunlight, the way the wind carried the faint scent of apples from the orchard, and how the distant hills seemed almost alive, rolling gently, hiding secrets she had yet to uncover, and her heart beat faster with anticipation because there was a seriousness in her grandfather's stride, a purpose that made her pulse quicken even as a strange flutter of nerves danced in her stomach. And when they reached the old barn at the far end of the property, Elena felt a sudden rush of familiarity mixed with wonder, because she had seen the barn countless times but never had the feeling that it was more than just a storage place for tools and old furniture, and now, with her grandfather standing before the rusty wooden door, brushing his hand over the worn latch, she realized that something important was about to happen, something he had kept hidden all these years, and she wondered briefly if it was a surprise, a lesson, or perhaps a story from the past he had been waiting to share. And when he finally opened the door, the hinges groaning like a whisper in the quiet morning, the warm light of the sun spilling across the dusty floor, Elena's eyes widened in both awe and confusion, because inside, it smelled of old wood and hay but also carried an unexpected sweetness, a hint of something she couldn't quite name, and her grandfather stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter, and she hesitated for a moment, caught between the thrill of discovery and a tiny fear of the unknown, but then curiosity overcame her, and she walked in slowly, each step echoing softly as if the barn itself were breathing with anticipation, and as she moved further, she noticed things she had never seen before, old shelves lined with boxes of forgotten items, tools meticulously arranged despite the dust, a faint trail of sunlight highlighting a small corner where shadows danced, and a sensation of quiet magic filled the air, as if the barn were alive with stories, memories, and emotions that had been waiting for her. And then her grandfather spoke, his voice gentle but heavy with meaning. "I want to show you something important," and Elena felt a shiver run down her spine, because she realized that whatever was coming would change how she saw her family, her past, and perhaps even herself, and as she turned to look at him, his eyes met hers with an intensity that both comforted and unsettled her, and in that moment, the world outside seemed to fade, the fields, the trees, the farmhouse, all of it dimmed in significance compared to the quiet promise of discovery inside this old barn, and she stepped closer, heart racing, palms slightly sweaty, sensing that this simple morning visit would mark the beginning of a story she would never forget, a story of connection, revelation, and the unspoken ties that bind generations together. And as her grandfather slowly closed the barn door behind them, a latch clicking with finality, Elena realized she was completely alone with him in a space that now felt like a portal to another time, a place where secrets waited patiently for her understanding, and with one final glance at the familiar beams, the old wooden floor, and the faint glimmer of sunlight dancing through cracks in the walls, she took a deep breath, ready to uncover whatever her grandfather had kept hidden, unaware that this moment, simple as it seemed, would set in motion a chain of emotions, realizations, and connections that would shape her life in ways she could never have imagined. As Elena stepped further into the barn, her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and she noticed a corner that seemed different from the rest, bathed in a soft glow that filtered through the cracks in the old wooden walls, and there, standing almost like a secret waiting for her, was a grand piano, its polished surface gleaming despite the dust and cobwebs surrounding it, and her heart skipped a beat because it seemed impossibly out of place among the hay bales and old tools, yet it felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her touch, and her grandfather's voice broke the silence, calm and slightly trembling with emotion. "This belonged to your grandmother," he said, and Elena froze, a rush of longing and curiosity flooding her chest, because she had never known much about her grandmother, only fragments of stories that spoke of a woman with a fierce love for music, a gentle heart, and a life cut short too soon. And now, standing here in this quiet barn, Elena felt a sudden connection, as if the piano itself held pieces of her grandmother's soul, waiting to be discovered, and without thinking, she walked closer, fingers hovering over the keys, feeling the smooth wood beneath her touch, and as soon as she pressed one, a soft, clear note filled the barn, echoing off the walls and stirring something deep inside her, a mix of wonder, nostalgia, and an ache she could not explain, and she turned to her grandfather, who watched her with eyes full of memories, his hand resting lightly on the piano, and he smiled faintly. She used to play every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes for no one at all, he said, and Elena's chest tightened, because she could imagine the scenes he described, a young woman pouring her heart into music, laughter and tears blending into melodies, a presence that seemed both near and far, alive in memory and absence at once, and she ran her fingers gently across the keys, each note unlocking fragments of a story she had never known but somehow felt she always belonged to, the notes dancing through the barn, carrying whispers of joy, heartbreak, and love, and as she played, she felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the raw beauty of it, the realization that someone she had never met had left behind a part of themselves for her to find, and her grandfather's voice softened further. Music is more than sound, it's memory, it's love, it's everything we can't say in words, and Elena nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, by the depth of emotion that filled the barn like sunlight, touching every dusty corner, and she continued to play, notes flowing faster now, fingers moving instinctively, as if guided by unseen hands, and each chord seemed to tell a story, stories of longing, heartbreak, hope, and quiet moments of pure joy, and as she played, she became aware of a subtle presence behind her, the sound of footsteps that belonged to someone who had been listening, and she turned slightly to see Daniel, her grandfather's apprentice, leaning against a post, watching her with a mixture of awe and something unspoken, a softness in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, and although they had spoken before, she had never noticed the way he seemed drawn to the music, how it mirrored feelings he rarely shared, and for a moment their eyes met, and in that brief glance, an invisible bond formed, fragile and tentative but undeniably present, and Elena realized that the barn was no longer just a place of past memories, it had become a space where emotions intertwined, where stories of old met the present, where new connections could bloom in quiet, tender ways. And yet even as she played and shared this silent communion, a shiver of uncertainty passed through her, a sense that there were still secrets the barn held, hidden corners that might reveal truths too powerful to ignore, and as her grandfather moved closer to adjust a pedal, the air thickened with anticipation, a gentle hush falling over the room, and she knew that this was only the beginning, that the piano was more than an instrument, it was a key, unlocking doors to her past, to feelings she had never understood, and perhaps to connections she had not yet dared imagine, and as the last notes of a melody lingered in the warm, dusty air, a quiet tension wrapped around her heart, a mixture of hope, longing, and the undeniable pull of something greater than herself, something that whispered promises of discovery, of emotion, of a life richer and fuller than she had ever expected, and in that moment, Elena understood that the barn had become a sanctuary. A place where the weight of the past and the possibilities of the future converged, where every sound, every glance, and every heartbeat mattered, and as she looked up at her grandfather and then at Daniel, the barn seemed to hold its breath with her, waiting for the next story to unfold, the next secret to be revealed, and she knew that nothing would ever feel the same again. Days passed, yet Elena could not shake the memory of that afternoon in the barn, the soft echo of piano notes lingering in her mind as if they had awakened something inside her that she could not name, and each evening she found herself drawn back to the old wooden door, the familiar crunch of leaves under her feet carrying her toward the sanctuary where memories and music intertwined, and when she arrived one late afternoon, sunlight spilling through the gaps in the walls, she was not alone. Daniel, the young apprentice who had quietly observed her playing before, stood at the far corner, his presence calm yet charged with an emotion that made her stomach twist in ways she could not explain, and when their eyes met, a silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of something neither had admitted aloud but both had felt, the subtle pull of connection that made time stretch and shrink simultaneously, and as Elena approached the piano, Daniel stepped closer, not to intrude, but to share in the music, and together they let their fingers glide across the keys, creating harmonies that neither had planned, yet somehow felt perfectly natural, a duet of unspoken words, longing, and fragile joy, and with each note, Elena felt layers of emotion rise, curiosity, admiration, a strange tenderness, and a hesitant hope, and Daniel seemed equally affected, his gaze softening, lips curving in a quiet smile that hinted at feelings unspoken, and the barn, once simply a place of dusty corners and forgotten tools, now seemed alive with a subtle magic. The air thick with the resonance of shared experience and the fragile tension of hearts learning to speak in a language beyond words, and as they played, the outside world faded, the distant hills, the orchard, the farmhouse, all became secondary to this bubble of sound and emotion, and Elena felt a warmth that was both thrilling and terrifying, a realization that the connection she was building with Daniel carried an intimacy that could change everything she thought she knew about herself and the quiet life she had lived, and yet, even as their hands brushed over the piano keys, a gentle restraint lingered, an invisible line neither dared cross, a mixture of respect, hesitation, and the fear of disrupting the delicate balance they had discovered, and when their fingers paused, the silence that filled the barn was not empty, it was full of unspoken words, stolen glances, and the tremor of feelings hovering just beneath the surface, and Elena realized that she had never felt such intensity before, not in friendships, not in fleeting crushes, not in any moment she could recall, and Daniel's presence amplified that awareness, making every heartbeat louder, every breath more conscious, every movement weighted with possibility, and as the late afternoon light slanted through the barn, catching dust in golden shafts, their eyes met again, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to acknowledge the pull they both felt, and Elena's heart raced as she contemplated what it meant to feel such connection with someone so quietly, so fully, without words, and Daniel's expression mirrored her thoughts, hesitant yet honest, aware yet cautious, and the piano, their music, and the barn itself seemed to bind them together, creating a space where vulnerability and desire coexisted safely, a fragile sanctuary where they could explore emotions too delicate to voice, and each shared melody, each glance, each subtle brush of hands, strengthened that bond, weaving threads of trust, attraction, and quiet longing into something tangible yet unspoken, and Elena could feel the story of their connection unfolding like the gentle rise and fall of a song, full of tension, beauty, and the promise of something more, and yet, as the shadows grew longer, she felt a pang of fear, a whisper in her mind that this delicate equilibrium could be broken, that stepping too close to the edge of her feelings might change the magic forever, and Daniel seemed to sense it too, pausing mid-note, eyes searching hers for understanding, for reassurance, for a sign that this was not only shared but safe, and in that suspended moment, with the barn enveloping them in warm golden light and the piano silent but alive with echoes of their emotions, Elena understood that this connection, fragile yet profound, was unlike anything she had ever experienced, that it held the power to awaken desires, fears, and hopes she had never fully acknowledged, and she felt the weight of that realization in every fiber of her being, every breath, every heartbeat, and as she glanced at Daniel one more time, a subtle smile playing on her lips, she knew that the barn was no longer just a place of memory and discovery. It had become a bridge between hearts, a space where attraction, admiration, and longing could coexist with safety and tenderness, a place where the next chapter of their lives, filled with emotion, revelation, and possibility, was quietly waiting to begin. And in that charged silence, Elena made a silent promise to herself to explore this bond carefully, to savor each moment, each note, each shared heartbeat, knowing that the barn held not only the music of the past but the fragile, beautiful music of their own story, unfolding note by note, day by day, in ways neither could have anticipated but both felt deep in their bones, and as they finally rose from the piano, their hands lingering near each other, the barn seemed to exhale with them, a quiet witness to a connection that was delicate, real, and ready to grow, and Elena stepped back toward the door, heart full, mind buzzing, aware that nothing outside the barn could diminish what had begun here, that the magic of this place, this music, and this shared vulnerability would linger with her forever, shaping her understanding of love, longing, and the beauty of connection that is as tender as it is profound, and as the last light of day faded into evening, Elena and Daniel shared a glance that spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings too strong to ignore, and she knew that the barn, the piano, and the music would always be there, waiting, a sanctuary for hearts daring enough to feel, to hope, and to dream. Together, the days that followed felt like a delicate dance between Elena and Daniel, their connection growing with every visit to the barn, each meeting infused with subtle glances, shared laughter, and moments of quiet understanding that spoke louder than words. And one rainy afternoon, the sky heavy with dark clouds and the scent of wet earth, Elena returned to the barn carrying a bundle of sheet music she had found in her grandmother's old desk, her hands trembling slightly, heart pounding with anticipation and a thrill she could not name, and as she stepped inside, the rain tapping gently against the wooden roof, she saw Daniel already there, leaning against the piano with that same quiet intensity that had first drawn her in, his eyes lighting up when he noticed her, a mixture of relief, admiration, and something tender and vulnerable that made her breath catch, and they greeted each other with a shy smile, the kind that held layers of emotion, unspoken questions, and the silent acknowledgement that their lives were intertwining in ways neither had expected, and Elena placed the sheet music on the piano, brushing her fingers over the keys as Daniel moved closer, their hands almost touching, the air around them thick with tension and warmth, and she began to play, a melody that was soft, nostalgic, and full of longing, notes flowing like whispered confessions, carrying memories of the past and the promise of something new, and Daniel joined in, harmonizing effortlessly, their music blending into a language only they understood, each chord and pause reflecting their heart's unspoken feelings, and as the sound filled the barn, Elena felt tears prickle her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming beauty of connection, of finally feeling seen and understood by someone who mirrored her emotions so perfectly, and she looked at Daniel, noticing the way his fingers danced across the keys with confidence yet gentleness, the way his eyes softened when he glanced at her, and in that moment, the barn seemed to shrink around them, becoming a cocoon where the past, present, and future collided in perfect harmony, and her grandfather, standing quietly in the doorway, watched them with a gentle smile, his presence a steady reassurance that this bond, tender yet strong, was cherished, protected, and allowed to flourish, and Elena realized that he had known all along, that the barn, the piano, and the stories of generations had been preparing her for this very moment, a moment of discovery, intimacy, and emotional awakening, and as the melody reached its crescendo, she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sensation of completeness, as if the music, the barn, and Daniel together had unlocked something in her that had always been waiting to be found, and Daniel's gaze held hers, steady and honest, reflecting a vulnerability that matched her own, and for the first time, Elena allowed herself to lean just slightly closer, not with urgency, but with the quiet courage of someone ready to embrace what had grown between them, the mutual longing, admiration, and deep emotional connection, and as the last notes lingered in the air, hanging like a promise, the rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle, mirroring the calm exhilaration inside, and Elena took a deep breath, letting herself absorb the significance of the moment, the realization that the barn had become more than a place of memory and music, it was a sanctuary of hearts, a place where attraction, trust, and emotional intimacy could thrive safely, and she felt the weight of all the quiet days spent alone, the anticipation, the longing, and how it had all led to this delicate, beautiful present, and Daniel's hand brushed hers as he reached to turn the page, the simple touch sending a shiver through her, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings they had nurtured carefully, honestly, and with tenderness, and in that gesture, Elena understood that love was not always loud or dramatic, sometimes it was subtle, built in small shared moments, in music played together, in glances that spoke more than words, and as they continued to play, the barn seemed to hum with energy, memories of the past intertwining with the promise of the future, a space where their hearts could explore emotion without fear or pretense, and Elena felt a surge of gratitude and hope, realizing that this connection, fragile yet undeniable, had the power to shape her, to teach her about patience, trust, and the beauty of shared vulnerability, and as the light outside faded into evening, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, Daniel finally paused, eyes holding hers with a quiet intensity, and she met his gaze without hesitation, feeling the depth of his sincerity, the honesty of his heart, and the promise of what could be, and in that instant, Elena understood that the barn, the piano, And the music had done more than reveal her grandmother's past, they had opened a door to her own future, a future filled with hope, tenderness, and the delicate thrill of love that grows not through grand gestures but through shared understanding, emotional honesty, and the courage to embrace feelings that had been waiting quietly for recognition. And as they closed the piano together, hands lingering, smiles shy yet full of emotion, Elena felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that this was only the beginning, that their story, written in music, glances, and quiet moments in the barn, would continue to unfold with every visit, every note, every heartbeat. And as the rain softened to a whisper and the barn held them in its warm embrace, Elena and Daniel shared a glance that said more than words ever could, a glance full of longing, admiration, and the promise of love tenderly nurtured. And she knew in her heart that the barn would always be their sanctuary, a place where memories, music, and emotion converged to create something lasting, beautiful, and profoundly theirs. And as they stepped toward the door together, the golden glow of the lanterns illuminating their faces, Elena felt a rush of joy and hope, certain that the connection born in that quiet barn, nurtured through music and understanding, would guide them through every challenge, every uncertainty, and every moment of life yet to come. And she realized, finally, that what her grandfather had shown her that day was not just an object, a piano, or a memory, but a lesson about love, patience, and the quiet magic of connection that changes everything in ways one could never anticipate. And as the door closed softly behind them, sealing the barn's secrets and stories for another day, Elena and Daniel walked into the twilight together, hearts full, souls aligned, knowing that life, like music, could carry them to places beyond their imagination, and that the bond they had discovered in the barn would remain with them forever, gentle, enduring, and profoundly transformative.